Forge, Chapter 2. The muskets on both sides fired, lightning flew from their barrels, the ravine darkened with gunpowder smoke and the curses of soldiers. I moved my toes in my sorry shoes, my fingers in the mud. I was still one shaking piece of Curzon. I peered at the two lines of soldiers. None were bleeding, not one had been hit. Have cock your firelocks, the redcoat called, ordering the men to begin loading their next shot. The rebels would not give them the time they needed. Advance! Bellowed an American officer. He charged across the bottom of the ravine, and his men followed, all pulling hunting knives or hatchets from their belts. In two heartbeats, they were halfway up the slope. Fall back! The British yelled. To the redoubt. They turned on their heels and ran, only a few steps ahead of screaming rebels. After they disappeared, I counted 2 score, and then 2 score more without moving. Gunfire cracked in the distance, then faded. I forced myself to stay hidden and listen to the sound of fire cannon or cannon fire. The British and Americans had been skirmishing for weeks since September's battle ended in a draw. The Americans were desperate to push the British back into Canada before the winter hit. Some fellows said that there would be one last battle, and that would be signaled by the firing of the cannons. The two armies would fight until blood soaked the ground. I listened. Geese honked high overhead. The wind shook the trees, sending leaves twirling to the ground. There was another crackle of faraway muskets, but no cannon. The great battle had not begun. I stood, brushed the leaves and dirt from my hat, and set it on my head. I was well and truly lost. The only way out was to retrace my steps past the shadow and the wolves. Just as I prepared to set out on my way, the way I came, I heard the sound of more boots crashing towards me. I hid behind a log again. I said, "Halt!" shouted the voice. A short British soldier stumbled into the ravine, chased by a gap-toothed rebel boy near my age, white-skinned, uncommonly tall, and armed with an ancient musket. "Stop there!" the boy yelled. The redcoat glared behind him, caught his foot on the half-buried root, and fell hard. His musket flew from his hand, but he quickly crawled to it. "You are my prisoner, sir," the boy declared in a shaky voice. "Lay down your musket." The redcoat had no intention of becoming a prisoner. He pulled out the gunpowder cartridge, ripped it open in his teeth, and poured the powder into his firing pan. His hands were shaking so violently that most of the powder fell to the ground. He pulled out the second cartridge and poured it with care. When the pan was primed, he shut it and poured the rest of the powder down the barrel. "Stop!" The boy brought the musket up to fire. "I swear I'll shoot." He wiped his right hand on his breeches, then cocked the firelock and slipped his finger into the trigger guard. The redcoat fumbled in his shot bag for a lead musket ball. The boy squeezed the trigger. His flint hit the empty firing pan with a dull clink. The musket did not fire. He had forgotten to prime his pan. The redcoat pulled out his ramrod. The boy grabbed the cork out of his powder horn. Uh, my palms were sweating, my eyes going back and forth, trying to figure who would win the race to load and shoot. A year earlier, I'd been a Patriot soldier enlisted as a substitute for a man who owned me. When the British attacked us at Fort Washington, I spent the entire day loading muskets for the other fellows to shoot with. I could prepare a musket for firing in my sleep. The redcoat rammed the musket ball at length of the barrel. The boy fumbled with his powder horn and dropped it to the leaves. The redcoat pulled out his ramrod and threw it aside. He raised the barrel without a word. The gap-toothed boy was about to be slaughtered. I had to help. My fingers curled around a muddy rock. The boy filled his firing pan and shut it. The redcoat cocked his firelock and reached for the trigger. I rose from my hiding place and threw the rock as hard as I could. It hit the redcoat square in the shoulder and threw off his aim just as he squeezed the trigger. The redcoat stared in disbelief at the hole he'd shot in the dirt. Then the boy fired his gun. This time the flint sparked the powder in the pan, which set off the powder in the barrel. That exploded the bullet across the ravine and into the body of his enemy. The British soldiers fell backwards, screaming, screaming, screaming. His hands clutched his belly. He'd been gut shot. The musket ball had ripped his middle right open. He rolled back and forth, screaming, screaming as blood welled up, covering his hands, rushing out from him to flood the fallen leaves and dirt. His boots twitched, his entire form shook, shuddered, and then he choked, for the blood filled his throat. His red-washed fingers clawed at his neck. Broken leaves flew into the air from the violence of the thrashing, and the gore and blood kept pouring from the black hole in his belly from his mouth. Surely enough blood for 10 men. The sight, horrid enough to make God himself weep. And suddenly his boots stopped running and his form stilled, and then death caught him.